He smiled at you before he killed you, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. Tonight, we examine 3 disturbing cases where the real story lurked behind what initially seemed entirely innocent. Every piece of this story was built on thorough research, verified facts, and a deep commitment to getting it right. No detail was chosen carelessly. Each one carries the significance of the true events behind it. The purpose of this channel is simple: to make sure history like this is never allowed to disappear. Now, please take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the Tagansky maniac, the kind eyes of a killer. Andrei Nikolaevich Evseev, a.k.a. the Smiling Slaughterer of Moscow. Now let's begin. Moscow, 1974, the Soviet Union, a nation that officially insisted crime didn't exist within its borders, was quietly bleeding. Women were being found dead in alleyways, in doorways near metro stations, their red dresses soaked darker than they were designed to be. Nobody could explain it. Nobody dared announce it too loudly. And yet the body count kept rising, silent and steady, like snow falling on a city that refused to look up. The man responsible wasn't a shadow. He wasn't a ghost. He was young. He was ordinary looking. Witnesses who survived described the same face again and again. Sideburns, calm expression, and what one dying woman rasped from her hospital bed before she took her last breath. Kind eyes. Kind eyes, belonging to a man who had just stabbed her and left her for dead. Andrei Evseev wasn't the monster Soviet citizens imagined lurked in the dark. He was the one who held the door open for you, smiled, and then followed you home. Please, if you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. There is a particular kind of quiet that wraps around small Soviet towns, the kind that feels less like peace and more like something being suppressed. Kharkovo, a modest settlement in the Moscow Oblast, was such a place. It was here, in 1955, that Andrei Nikolaevich Evseev was born into the gray fabric of Soviet daily life, in a country where conformity was not merely encouraged, it was enforced. From the outside, there was nothing to mark him. No visible wound. No obvious malformation of character that adults around him would clock in those early years. He was simply a boy in a town that didn't expect greatness from its children and rarely got it. What nobody around him understood was that behind his unremarkable exterior, something was quietly curdling. Evseev's educational journey was brief and unremarkable. He abandoned school after completing only the 7th grade. Not because he lacked intelligence, but because whatever structure school offered him, it held no appeal. He drifted. He became, for a period, a model. An irony almost too bitter to acknowledge given what he would become. He worked as a laboratory assistant. He briefly served as a sailor. These occupations were not chosen out of passion. They were the scattered pursuits of a young man who had no clear map and no real investment in building one. He moved through the roles like a traveler passing through train stations, present for a moment, then gone. What cracked the surface came in the early 1970s. Evseev was placed in a psychiatric clinic. The nature of the referral, the exact events that led him through those institutional doors, has not been detailed in surviving records with precise clarity. But what emerged from that experience, in Evseev's own later words, is chilling in its directness. He said, "I left the hospital a complete fool for all the drugs that were injected into me in the hospital. I experienced a very painful state, difficulties in brain activity. I considered people to be my first enemies. Not a specific person, not a group, people, all of them. The doctors who sought to treat him had, by his own account, handed him a worldview that classified every breathing human being as a threat to be neutralized. Whatever the psychiatric clinic intended, What walked out of its doors was something different from what walked in. He was not yet 20 years old when the killing began. August 25th, 1974. The city of Zagorsk, today known as Sergiev Posad, sits northeast of Moscow, close enough to the capital to feel its pulse but far enough to feel removed from its scrutiny. On that late summer day, Evsif moved through the city with a knife and a focus that was anything but aimless. His first victim was Marina Morozova, 16 years old, a schoolgirl. She was wearing red. That detail, the color of her clothing, would become a thread woven through the entire early chapter of his crimes. Whether the red triggered something particular in him or whether it was a matter of pure visibility in a crowd is a question the record doesn't conclusively answer. What is known is that he attacked her and killed her, 16 years old, not yet finished with school, not yet finished with anything, and Evsif ended her before she had the chance to begin. The following day, less than 24 hours later, he was already moving again. At the Odintsovo railway station, he came upon Gennady Kuzmin, a 66-year-old chef. The man was older. He was slower. He would have had no reason to fear the young man who approached him. Evsif drove a knife into him multiple times. Kuzmin fell. Evsif stood over his body, rifled through his pockets, and stripped him of what little he carried. Money and a grocery order, the kind of scarcity item that Soviet citizens traded with almost sacred reverence. A broiler chicken and 3 kilograms of Bulgarian peaches. He then dragged the body to a roadside ditch and disposed of it like something broken and no longer needed. He was 19 years old. He had now killed twice in 2 days. He was not panicking. He was not trembling. He walked away. The Soviet investigative machinery, already operating under the ideological handicap of a state that publicly denied the existence of serious domestic crime, picked up the scent of the murders and moved in entirely the wrong direction. Suspicion fell on a 20-year-old military deserter named Sergei Savliev, who happened to be in the Kemerovo Oblast region around the time of the crimes. Under pressure, Savliev confessed to the murder of Marina Morozova, a confession that, as subsequent events would prove, was not rooted in truth. He was arrested, processed, and filed away while the actual killer remained free and entirely unsuspected. September arrived, and Evsif arrived in Moscow. In the park surrounding the Palace of Culture named after the Third International, he attacked a student named Vladimir Parshin, opening 4 knife wounds across the young man's body. Parshin, against probability, survived. Whether it was the location, a park with enough foot traffic to make extended violence risky, or something else that caused Evsif to pull back before finishing what he started, Parshin lived. He lived and said nothing specific enough to generate a name. Then, on September 24th, in a building near the Dobraninskia metro station, Evsif found Anna Astafieva. He attacked her. He robbed her. He left her in a condition the records describe as being on the verge of life and death. But Anna Astafieva, in the gasping fragment of consciousness she retained, did something that no other victim had managed. She described him. Her description was specific enough to be remembered and repeated. A young man with sideburns and kind eyes. She delivered this portrait of her attacker with whatever breath remained in her, and then she was transferred to hospital, and then she died. But her words outlived her. 2 days later, on September 26th, at the 43rd kilometer station in the Moscow Oblast, Evsif attacked again, this time targeting a man. The attack was vicious enough to inflict serious injury, but something went wrong with the instrument of violence itself. The knife broke during the assault. The blade snapped off and lodged in the victim's back. That man, Nikolai Diamin, 42 years old, a figure who had spent nearly 20 years in Soviet prisons, died later in hospital with Evsif's blade still buried in him. What Evsif did next reveals a level of calculation that separates him from killers who act on pure impulse alone. He dressed the corpse of Diamin, who bore a physical resemblance to Evsif himself, in his own clothes. The intention was explicit: to create confusion, to make investigators believe that Evsif was Diamin, and that Diamin, now dressed in Evsif's clothing and lying dead, was the perpetrator of all the robberies and murders. The ruse worked, at least initially. Early investigative thinking treated the dead man as a suspect, and the trail went cold accordingly. But Evsif was already moving again. October 8, 1974, in the Tagansky district of Moscow, the neighborhood that would eventually lend him his most enduring name, he executed 3 robbery attacks in a single day. All 3 victims were women. All 3 were wearing red. 2 of them died from their knife wounds. 1 survived. The pace of this 3 attacks, same district, same day, was not the behavior of someone afraid of detection. It was the behavior of someone who had not yet found a reason to be afraid. The panic that followed was unlike anything Moscow's carefully managed public sphere usually permitted. Citizens whispered about a killer of women in red. The phrase passed between neighbors, between workers on factory floors, between women who began making quiet, frightened choices about what to wear when they left their apartments. 7 days later, on October 15th, near the Akademikskaya metro station, Evsif struck twice more, 2 attacks in 20 minutes. 1 victim died. On October 16th, near the Proletarskia metro station, he executed a double attack again. 1 woman died. This time, the victims were not wearing red. The color, it turned out, had never been a firm requirement. It had simply been what caught his eye first. Something extraordinary then happened. The Soviet state, the same system that routinely minimized or suppressed public discussion of serious crime, blinked. The Minister of Internal Affairs of the USSR, Nikolai Shelikov, appeared on state television. He addressed the nation. He warned citizens to exercise caution. For the Soviet Union of 1974, this was an almost unprecedented act of public acknowledgement. The system that preferred silence chose speech, and it was that speech, that rare, frightened crack in the official mask, that gave Evsif pause. Frightened by the scale of attention, he stopped. Not arrested. Not caught. Not stopped by law enforcement. He simply chose to pause, and nearly 2 entire years passed in relative quiet while the investigation churned through dead ends and the city exhaled, not knowing the man behind the fear was still breathing, still free, still watching. Silence is not the same as peace. The nearly 2 years that followed Evsif's sudden retreat from violence in late 1974 were not years of transformation. He did not seek help. He did not flee the country or bury himself in honest labor and attempt to outrun what he was. He existed. He moved through Soviet daily life, working, sleeping, eating, while inside him, whatever drove the knife remained coiled and patient, waiting for the moment when fear of exposure dimmed enough to act again. November 1976. The gap closed. Evsif re-emerged with an efficiency that suggested no meaningful internal struggle had taken place during the interim. Within the span of a single month, he committed 4 robberies. 2 of those 4 ended in murder. The precise identities and full details of these November 1976 victims have not been exhaustively documented in the public record available outside Soviet-era investigative files, but the pattern was consistent with everything that preceded it. Approaching targets alone, in the kinds of places where a solitary person could disappear from view before the violence was fully processed by anyone nearby. Quick, controlled, then gone. What the resumption confirmed was that the 2-year gap had not been recovery. It had been strategy. Evsif had responded to public pressure by removing himself from the board temporarily, reducing his activity to 0 so the investigation would lose momentum and the public's heightened alertness would fade. And it had worked. By 1976, women in Moscow were no longer making pointed decisions about the color of their clothing. The urgency had quietly dissolved, and Evsif read that dissolution accurately. Through 1977, he continued to operate a series of robberies in Moscow and the broader region, with the methods he had refined across the previous years. Then, in the autumn of 1977, he made contact with someone whose name carried more weight than most of his victims. Nina Delingin, a secretary and typist employed by the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the CPSU, the governing body of the entire Soviet state. The method he used on her was different from the knife that had been his primary instrument until this point. He struck her on the head with a screwdriver. The attack was severe. She survived. The presence of a CPSU secretary in his victim list was not a political statement on Evsif's part. There is no evidence he selected her for ideological reasons. She was simply a woman alone, carrying something he wanted, and she encountered him at the wrong moment. But nothing in Evsef's criminal history matched what came next. Lydia Kuprianova. Her name alone carries a specific gravity because of who she was connected to. Her husband, Mikhail Kuprianov, was a member of the celebrated Soviet artistic collective known as Kukriniksi, a trio of artists whose satirical and wartime illustrations were embedded in Soviet cultural identity at the highest institutional level. Lydia Kuprianova was not a minor figure by association. She existed within a social orbit that brushed against the cultural elite of the USSR. None of that protected her. Evsef found her. He attacked her with the violence he had practiced across years of escalating crimes. He killed her. And then, for the first time in his documented history, he committed an act that crossed a boundary he had not crossed before. He raped her posthumously. The introduction of this element into his pattern of crime is significant not because it changes the severity of what preceded it, 9 murders, scores of stabbings, years of predatory violence, but because it marked a shift in what he was willing to do in the moments after death. Whether this was a progression of his pathology, a deliberate escalation, or something that had always lurked beneath the surface of his other crimes and now finally surfaced is something that forensic psychology can speculate about, but the record cannot definitively resolve. What the record shows is that it happened, and that it happened here with this victim at this point in his career of violence. Investigators connected to the Kuprianova murder were now under enormous pressure. The victim's social proximity to Soviet cultural institutions, the brutality of the crime, the posthumous assault, all of it created a heat that ordinary murders in the Soviet system rarely generated. Resources and attention were directed toward finding whoever was responsible. Evsef, characteristically, moved before the heat reached him. December 19, 1977. The village of Sofrino, a public space, the backyard of a store called Housewares, visible in the middle of the day to dozens of people. Evsef made no apparent effort to ensure he was unseen. Whether this was confidence, recklessness, or a kind of fatalistic indifference to being caught is not something his own later statements clarify. He attacked Lydia Schur. He killed her. He took her watch, her money, her jewelry. He took her dog collar. And then, in front of a space populated by the kind of daytime foot traffic that Soviet daily life routinely generated, he raped her corpse as well. The number of people in the vicinity of this final murder meant that, for the first time in his career, witnesses had genuinely useful details to offer investigators. A man in a corduroy jacket, present at the scene, suspicious in his demeanor. The description of the jacket moved quickly through the local social web of the village. A circle of acquaintances reported that a man named Shanov had appeared among them, wearing a velvet corduroy jacket. The jacket was subsequently found. It had blood on it. A knife was in one of its pockets. Shanov was arrested, but Shanov had an explanation. He said someone else had given him the jacket. The examination of Shanov's testimony confirmed it. He was telling the truth. He was not the killer. The jacket had passed hands. And the question of whose hands it had originally left shifted the investigation in a new direction. Another witness then reported something seemingly minor. A stranger glimpsed on a train passing through Khatkovo, dressed in a railwayman's uniform. This detail, combined with a database search for individuals with prior criminal records who matched the physical description that had been assembled across 3 years of witness accounts. Sideburns, young, male, associated with the Khatkovo area, produced a name. Andrei Evsef, 22 years old, criminal record, born in Khatkovo. December 28, 1977 was 3 days after Christmas by the Western calendar, though the Soviet Union had little official use for Christmas. What it had was New Year, the great Soviet substitute celebration, a holiday the state had been happy to retain while stripping it of religious content. Evsef, at home in Khatkovo, was decorating his New Year's tree, not with tinsel or baubles purchased from a state shop, with jewelry, the rings, the necklaces, the glittering stolen remnants of the lives he had taken. He had turned his holiday tree into a display case for his trophies, the intimate property of murdered women, hanging from the branches like ornaments in some private celebration known only to him. When the investigators came to his door, he moved quickly. He stripped the jewelry from the tree and hid it. By the time the officers entered the apartment, there was nothing obviously incriminating visible. The rooms were searched. Everything seemed ordinary. The search turned up almost nothing, almost. In one corner of the apartment, seemingly innocuous. A dog collar. Just a dog collar, the kind kept as a sentimental object by anyone who had lost a beloved pet. Efsif looked at the investigators and offered exactly that explanation. His dog had died. He had kept the collar as a memory of the animal he loved. It was the sort of explanation designed to produce a nod and an apology for the intrusion. The collar had belonged to Lydia Schur, but there was not yet enough. Efsif was held, and the interrogation began. He was not cooperative. He was defiant, displaying the same cold, calculating control he had exercised at every crime scene across 3 years. He refused to engage with the female investigator assigned to his case. He would not speak to her. He looked past her as though she wasn't present. The investigators, assessing what kind of creature they were dealing with, adapted. They brought him salted herring, a specific food request. The kind of detail that in the abstract sounds absurd, but in the reality of a Soviet interrogation cell in 1977 was a meaningful concession, an acknowledgement that this suspect responded to being treated as someone whose preferences mattered. Efsif ate the entire fish, bones included. Then he began to talk. But even before the herring produced its confessional thaw, something happened that cracked the case open from an unexpected angle. On December 31st, 1977, New Year's Eve, Efsif was in his cell, and he spoke to his cellmate. The cellmate was listening carefully, because the cellmate was an informant. In the middle of what may have seemed like idle, strange conversation, Efsif dropped a phrase that made no sense on its surface unless you knew what it meant. "My mother, I suppose, already baked pies with jewels." An odd, almost poetic statement. The investigators who received the informant's report turned it over and recognized what it pointed to. The stolen jewelry had been hidden somewhere in his mother's possession, specifically in a bag of flour. A second search of Efsif's apartment confirmed it. The jewels were there, compressed into the dense, white anonymity of flour, waiting. With the jewelry in hand and the confession following it, the full scope of what Efsif had done began to assemble itself into a documented record. He admitted to 9 murders. He admitted to 18 attempted murders, the 18 people he had stabbed, slashed, or battered who had survived through luck or constitution or the intervention of passers-by. He admitted to 1 rape, the posthumous assault on Lydia Schur. He admitted to 32 robberies. The numbers, laid out in a list, have the quality of an accounting ledger, methodical, accumulated, precise. 3 years of sustained predatory violence across multiple districts of Moscow and the wider oblast, with victims ranging from a 16-year-old schoolgirl to a 66-year-old chef, from a Communist Party secretary to the wife of a celebrated artist. What the interrogations also revealed was the nature of the man on the other side of the table. Efsif did not crumble. He did not weep. He did not perform remorse, even badly. He felt none, and he appeared to understand no social obligation to pretend otherwise. While awaiting trial, he exercised every morning. He maintained his physical condition with disciplined regularity, as though preparing for something rather than waiting for an end. He made his contempt for ordinary Soviet citizens explicit. He despised, he said, those who worked and lived from salary to salary. The masses who ground themselves down in honest labor for modest, predictable lives had earned nothing but his scorn. He placed himself in a separate category, not above them by any quality he could articulate, but separate from them by the choices he had made and the actions he had taken. Forensic psychiatric examination was conducted as part of the legal process leading to trial. The findings were specific in their conclusion. Efsif was mentally competent to stand trial. He understood the nature of his actions. He understood the distinction between lawful and unlawful conduct. He was not, in the legal sense that would exempt him from criminal responsibility, insane. Alongside the determination of competency, the examiners gave him a diagnosis. sociopathy. What contemporary clinical language would term antisocial personality disorder. An individual without the internal architecture of empathy, without the emotional braking systems that prevent most human beings from treating other people as objects to be taken from, injured, or discarded. He was not confused about what he was doing. He simply did not register it the way other people would. The suffering of others passed through him and left no mark. The trial proceeded, and Evseef conducted himself with the same unbroken composure he had maintained throughout. The evidence was comprehensive. The confessions were on record. The jewelry pulled from the flower was catalogued. The witnesses who had survived described the same face, the same sideburns, the same unsettling calm. The woman who died in hospital had described his eyes as kind, and in some ways that detail haunted the proceedings more than any piece of physical evidence. The idea that the face which had appeared gentle and approachable to the people he killed was the same face that sat across the courtroom, unrepentant, watching. The court sentenced Andrei Nikolaevich Evseef to death. In 1979, Andrei Evseef was executed by firing squad. He was 23 or 24 years old, depending on the exact month of his birth in 1955, which the record does not pin to a specific date. He died younger than most people graduate from university. He had, in the 4 active years of his criminal career, murdered 9 human beings, attempted to murder 18 more, and committed 32 robberies across one of the most surveilled and controlled urban environments in the world, the capital of a police state that theoretically prided itself on knowing where its citizens were and what they were doing. He had operated within that system's blind spots and exploited its ideological embarrassments. He had stopped when the state drew attention to itself and resumed when the attention faded. He had been strategic without being a genius. He had been controlled without being invulnerable. And he had ultimately been caught not through any single dramatic breakthrough, but through the accumulation of small details: a jacket that changed hands, a train ride that was witnessed, a database search that matched a description to a name from a town northeast of the city. The execution closed the legal chapter. But the story that the Tagansky maniac left behind is not contained within the dates of his crimes or even within the borders of the Soviet Union that produced him. Consider what the city of Moscow experienced in October 1974. Women were choosing their clothing with fear. Families were having quiet, anxious conversations about routes home from work. The whisper network that Soviet society had always maintained. The system of information that moved between trusted individuals because official channels were not trusted, was carrying news that the state had not yet officially acknowledged. Women in red were dying. A maniac was moving through the Tagansky district. And then the Soviet state did something it almost never did. It admitted, through the mouth of its Minister of Internal Affairs speaking on state television, that there was a threat, that citizens should be cautious, that the streets were not entirely safe. For Soviet citizens in 1974, this admission was more frightening than the murders themselves in certain ways. If the state was saying it openly, how bad was the reality it had chosen to show only part of? The state's fear of public acknowledgement is woven into the shape of this case from start to finish. The wrong man, Sergei Savliev, the young military deserter, was arrested and processed in connection with the early murders. He confessed. He was held. The actual killer was not interrupted by this error. He continued. The machinery of Soviet criminal justice, under pressure to produce results and wary of advertising its failures, moved in directions that served the institution before they served the truth. Savliev's false confession was the kind of outcome that an interrogation process built around pressure rather than evidence was engineered to produce. It is not documented whether Savliev served a sentence for a crime he did not commit. What is documented is that the arrest of an innocent man did not slow Evseef by a single day. The victims deserve to be held in focus rather than reduced to a list. Marina Morozova was 16, a schoolgirl in a red dress in Zagorsk on a late August day, encountering a man with a knife and kind eyes. She was the first, which means in the record of this case she carries the weight of everything that came after, every person who died because Evseef was not caught when she was. Gennady Kuzmin was 66 years old, a working man, a chef, murdered by a railway station and thrown into a ditch for a chicken and some peaches. Anna Astafyeva, who in her dying moments produced the description that would follow the investigation for years. The sideburns, the kind eyes, deserves recognition not just as a victim but as someone who, in extremis, attempted to reach across the darkness and hand investigators the shape of the person who had killed her. She did not survive to see him caught, but her words survived. The victims of October 8th in the Tagansky district, the 2 women killed out of 3 attacked in a single day, died in a neighborhood that gave the killer his name, a name that now carries the cold weight of what he did there. The women attacked near Akademikskaya and Proletarskia metro stations, ordinary transit infrastructure, the kind of underground corridors that Muscovites used every day for the ordinary rhythms of Soviet life, became briefly places of dread. And then they became ordinary again, which is the particular cruelty of urban violence. The city heals its visible surface faster than it heals the people who moved through those spaces and now carry different knowledge. Nikolai Dyamin, 42 years old, a man who had spent the better part of 2 decades in Soviet prisons, was murdered not out of particular selection but because he was there, and because his resemblance to Evsif made him useful dead. Evsif dressed the body of a man he had just killed in his own clothes and used the corpse as a decoy. The detail is one of the most analytically revealing in the entire case, because it shows that Evsif was not operating on pure animal impulse. Between the violence and the escape, there was a thinking process. There was a risk assessment. There was a plan. A man who can murder someone and immediately begin constructing an elaborate misdirection using the body is a man who, in that moment, is calm enough to plan. The two are not in contradiction. They are both the same person. Lydia Kuprianova and Lydia Schur, the final 2 murder victims, carry the full weight of what Evsif had become by the end of his criminal career. The posthumous assaults, the element added to the final 2 murders that had not appeared in the preceding 7, are documented not to sensationalize, but because they mark a genuine shift in the nature of the crimes. The investigation was already under pressure from the Kuprianova murder because of the victims' social connections. The murder of Lydia Schur in a public space, with witnesses present, suggests either that Evsif had developed a level of confidence in his invulnerability that had detached from reality, or that the compulsion driving him had become strong enough to override the caution that had kept him operational for 3 years. Perhaps both. He had, after all, paused for 2 years when the state turned up the pressure in 1974. By 1977, he appeared to believe that no level of pressure would reach him. He was wrong. The New Year's tree decorated with dead women's jewelry. That image, that single, specific detail drawn from the December 28, 1977 arrest. It is the image that perhaps most completely captures who Andrei Evsif was, because it was private. It was not performed for anyone. It was not a statement directed at police or society or the state. It was something he did for himself, an aesthetic choice, a personal ritual, a quiet decoration that he looked at alone and found satisfying. The rings and necklaces of the women he had killed, arranged among the branches of a Soviet New Year's tree, glittering in the light of an apartment in Kotkovo. Whatever he felt when he looked at them, satisfaction, pride, pleasure, the simple comfort of objects he had taken and kept, he felt it alone. It was the most honest moment in the entire record of his crimes. No performance, no audience, just him, his trophies, and his tree. He hid the jewels when they came for him, reflexive, fast. The survival instinct operating at the same speed as the violence always had. He told them the dog collar was a memory of a beloved animal. He refused to speak to the female investigator. He demanded and received his salted herring. He ate it bones and all. He confessed. He exercised every morning while awaiting trial. He despised salary earners. He felt no remorse. He was executed. He was 23 years old. The name the city gave him, the Tagansky Maniac, is the name that endured, attached to the district where he struck 3 times in a single day and left 2 women dead. But the other names that attached to him across the investigation carry their own meaning. The killer of women in red, earned in October 1974, before anyone knew it was the same person each time. The killer with sideburns, drawn from Anna Astafyeva's dying description. The killer with kind eyes. From the same source, the same last breath, the same woman who tried to give investigators a face and died before she knew if it would help. Kind eyes. It is the phrase that refuses to release its grip, not because it is ironic in the cheap sense, though it is that, but because it points at something genuinely disorienting about the nature of human threat. We have evolved to read faces for safety cues. We assess the strangers we encounter in parks, on trains, in apartment corridors, near metro stations, and we make rapid, largely unconscious judgments about danger. For most of human history, this system has served adequately. Evsif was the person those systems were not designed to catch, someone whose face produced the wrong reading, someone whose eyes conveyed warmth and approachability while his hand gripped a knife. The very quality that should have warned his victims away was reversed in him, made into access, made into closeness, made into the last thing some of them ever saw. He operated in Moscow at a time when the Soviet state was structurally unwilling to acknowledge the kind of predator he represented. Serial violence was not, officially, a feature of socialist society. The ideological framework insisted that the conditions producing such pathology were products of capitalism. Poverty, inequality, exploitation, and that the USSR, having solved these structural problems, had therefore solved the problem of murderous individuals. Evsif's existence was not merely a criminal matter. It was an embarrassment. The Minister of Internal Affairs appearing on television in 1974 was not an act of transparency. It was an act of desperation, a controlled disclosure designed to produce public caution without publicly admitting the full horror of what was moving through the city. The state revealed the minimum it believed necessary to protect itself from greater embarrassment, and nothing more. Evsif exploited that embarrassment. He exploited the gaps. He exploited the tendency of a surveillance state to arrest a confessor and close the file rather than continue investigating. He exploited the geography of Moscow's transit system. The metro stations that moved enormous numbers of people through underground corridors in consistent daily patterns, producing a reliable stream of potential targets moving alone, distracted, routine habituated, through spaces that felt safe because they were familiar. He exploited the color red for as long as it served him, and then he abandoned it when it became a specific enough signature that women began avoiding it. He was adaptive. He was patient. He was cold. The Soviet state executed him in 1979, and in doing so, ensured that whatever else he might have confessed, whatever fuller account he might have given of his own internal experience, was silenced permanently. Forensic psychiatry identified the sociopathy. Criminal law identified the murders, the attempts, the robberies, the rape. But the deeper territory, the interior of what Andrei Evsif actually experienced when he killed, what he felt when he looked at the jeweled tree, what moved through him in the gap between the knife and the running, that territory died with him. What remained was the record. 9 murdered, 18 nearly murdered, 32 robberies, 3 years of active operation, 2 years of calculated silence, a dog collar kept as a trophy explained as grief for a pet, a New Year's tree, a bag of flour, a phrase spoken to an informant on New Year's Eve. My mother, I suppose, already baked pies with jewels. Strange words from a strange man, decoded into evidence, collapsed into a death sentence, and carried forward as a document of what Soviet Moscow produced in the mid-1970s. A young man from a small town with kind eyes and sideburns and no operational concept of the value of another person's life. The city moved on. The metro stations kept running. New Year trees went back to being decorated with tinsel and glass. The Tagansky district, which had briefly become a name that mothers said to daughters as a warning, became again simply a neighborhood. But somewhere in the particular architecture of Soviet silence, in the space between what the state admitted and what it suppressed, between the false confession of an innocent young deserter and the real killer decorating his holiday tree, the story of Andrei Nikolaevich Evsif stayed buried. Not fully, not permanently. The document exists. The names exist. The 9 dead are on record. And now the record speaks. If you're new here, welcome. This is a channel where true crime is told with calm and care. A huge thank you to the subscribers who've been here from the start. Your support means everything. If you're still watching, drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from, or just say hello. And if you haven't already, Like this video and subscribe so you never miss a story. Now, let's get into our second story. Story 2. The Ghost in the Forest Belt. Nikolai Borisovich Fefilov, a.k.a. the Ural Strangler, the elusive predator, the necrophile of Sverdlovsk. He had a wife, 2 daughters, a job at a newspaper, and he strangled 7 people. While the Soviet state executed an innocent man for his crimes and called it justice, there is a particular kind of evil that does not announce itself. It does not wear a mask or whisper warnings. It walks among ordinary people, clocks in for work, comes home for dinner, and then, when the moment arrives, it moves through the trees like smoke, wraps its hands around a child's throat, and vanishes before the world even knows it has been visited by something monstrous. Sverdlovsk, Soviet Union, 1982. A city sealed tight by communist ideology, where crime was not supposed to exist, where the state believed its own propaganda so deeply that when a predator began hunting women and children in the forest belt along the Staromoskovsky Road, the machinery of Soviet law enforcement did not search harder. It simply grabbed the nearest vulnerable man, beat a confession out of him, and told the grieving public that justice had been served. An innocent man went to his death. The real killer went home to his daughters. And then, when the silence felt safe enough, he went back into the trees and did it again. This is the story of Nikolai Borisovich Fefilov, a man who for 6 years remained untouchable, not because he was brilliant, but because a broken system was too proud to admit it had been wrong. 7 confirmed victims. Multiple innocent people jailed, tortured, and in at least one case killed because of fabricated confessions. A case so deeply stained by institutional rot that when Fefilov was finally caught, those in power found it more convenient to have him strangled in his prison cell than to let him speak in open court. Stay with this story, because what happened in that Ural forest belt is not just about a killer. It is about what happens when an entire government becomes complicit in letting him thrive. Sverdlovsk in 1982 was not the kind of city that invited scrutiny. Nestled deep in the Ural Mountains, it was an industrial stronghold of the Soviet Union, gray, functional, proud in that severe Soviet way that tolerated no weakness and even less embarrassment. It was a closed city for much of the Cold War, a place where military factories hummed behind walls and citizens moved through their days with the practiced compliance of people who understood that the state watched everything and questioned nothing. Crime, according to the official Soviet narrative, was a product of capitalism. Sverdlovsk was socialist. Sverdlovsk was safe. Nikolai Borisovich Fefilov was born in Sverdlovsk on July 24, 1946. He grew up in the city, attended school, and after finishing his education he joined the military, serving until his demobilization in 1966. What happened in the years immediately following his return is, on the surface, unremarkable. He fell for a neighbor. She refused him. That rejection, small and ordinary by most human measures, lodged itself somewhere inside him like a splinter, too deep to extract, too irritating to ignore. Investigators who later studied his psychology would point to that moment as a fracture, the place where something in Fefilov quietly cracked. He moved on, or appeared to. He married. His wife bore him 2 daughters. He secured employment at the publishing house of the Ural Worker newspaper, where he worked as a printer. From the outside, his life looked like every other life in Sverdlovsk. Cramped, modest, Soviet. The family lived in a communal apartment, sharing walls and a building with strangers, a source of constant friction between Fefilov and his wife. He wanted a private apartment. The state had not provided one. That frustration, small and domestic as it sounds, became a drumbeat in their marriage, arguments cycling through the same grievances, the same unresolved humiliations, the same sense of a man who felt the world owed him something it kept refusing to deliver. On the morning of April 29, 1982, Fefilov and his wife had another quarrel. The details of what was said between them have been lost to history, but the consequence is not. Fefilov left his apartment that day carrying something that cannot be named precisely. Rage, contempt, a need that had been building for years without a name or a face. He walked toward the forest belt near the Staromoskovsky Road, to the area surrounding the Kontrolnaya bus stop in the Verkhaisetsky district. It was a stretch of semi-wooded ground on the city's edge, the kind of in-between space that exists in most Soviet cities, neither fully urban nor rural, where people passed through without stopping, where children sometimes walked alone. Lena Mangasheva was 11 years old. She was a fifth-grade student at school number 41, and she was on her way somewhere that April afternoon when Fefilov found her in that forest belt. She was alone. What he did to her was methodical and deliberate. He raped her. He then took her pioneer tie, the red neckerchief worn by Soviet schoolchildren as a symbol of their membership in the Young Pioneers, a garment that to every child in the USSR represented childhood itself, and he strangled her with it. He covered her small body with branches, the way a person covers something they intend to revisit. He took her rucksack, removing a pencil case and 2 textbooks before discarding the bag in the toilet of a nearby gas station. Then he walked away. Lena's body was discovered the following day. The branches were not enough of a concealment, and the forest belt gave her up easily. What the forest could not give up was the man who had put her there. Investigators descended on the Kontrolnaya bus stop area, beginning the methodical Soviet process of elimination, checking known offenders, reviewing prior convictions, casting the net wide across the city's registered criminals and mentally ill residents. Within days, a name surfaced. Georgy Khabarov, 28 years old, classified as intellectually disabled, previously convicted for robbery and a charge of attempted rape, released from prison years earlier. He was exactly the kind of man the Soviet system found convenient, marginal, voiceless, without resources or influence, the sort of person a prosecutor could point to in front of a grieving community and say, "Here is your monster." On May 5th, a resident of Sverdlovsk named him. Khabarov was brought in. His first interrogation produced nothing useful. Khabarov said he had been at home all day on April 29th. He was not believed. Over the following days, he was subjected to what the Soviet criminal justice system euphemistically called a series of interrogations, a phrase that anyone familiar with Soviet detention practices understands to mean sustained psychological and physical pressure applied until the desired result is achieved. On May 7th, Khabarov confessed. But the confession was wrong in almost every particular. He named the wrong location for the crime. He said he had killed Lena with a knife, when in fact she had been strangled. His description of the girl's appearance was inaccurate. He could not correctly describe her underwear or her rucksack, which had not yet been found. His testimony shifted and changed with every retelling. None of this mattered to the investigators who had already decided. Witnesses were found or cultivated. One acquaintance of Khabarov's claimed to have seen him near the murder site on the day in question. Other acquaintances and Khabarov's own mother said plainly that he had not been there. A blood type test was performed on biological material recovered from Lena Mangasheva's body. The results were declared to match Khabarov's blood type. Years later, after Fefilov was arrested, the test was re-examined. The blood type had been identified incorrectly. But in September 1982, none of that mattered. The Sverdlovsk Regional Court found Georgy Khabarov guilty of the rape and murder of Lena Mangasheva, plus additional charges. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Khabarov appealed immediately. His cassation letter to the Supreme Court of Russia was a desperate document. He insisted he had not been near the murder scene. He denied every charge, and he described the physical and psychological abuse he had suffered during interrogation. The Supreme Court received a second cassation that same season, from the murdered girl's mother, who demanded not a reduced sentence but an increased one. She wanted Khabarov executed. She had attached a collective letter from workers at a Sverdlovsk enterprise, a document signed by ordinary citizens demanding the death penalty for a man who had nothing to do with what happened to her daughter. On November 22, 1982, the Supreme Court reviewed both appeals. It canceled the original verdict, not because it found Khabarov innocent, but because it found procedural errors and returned the case for retrial. On March 23, 1983, the Sverdlovsk Regional Court convicted Khabarov again. This time, the sentence was death. On April 27, 1984, Georgy Khabarov was executed. Nikolai Fefilov was alive. Nikolai Fefilov was free. Nikolai Fefilov was at work at the Ural Worker newspaper, setting type and printing pages and going home to his family in the communal apartment where his wife still complained about not having their own space. And in the months while Khabarov sat on death row waiting for a bullet, Fefilov had already returned to the forest belt. On August 7, 1983, while Georgy Khabarov awaited execution for a crime he did not commit, Nikolai Fefilov was back at the Kontrolnaya bus stop. Gulnara Yakupova was 22 years old. She had come to Sverdlovsk from Bashkiria, far enough from home that her absence would not immediately alarm anyone. She was a student and worked at the Viz factory. On that August day, she crossed paths with Fefilov in the area near the Staromoskovsky Road. He raped her. He then strangled her with a belt. Not a child's tie this time, but a deliberate, adult instrument of death applied with full force. Her body was hidden in the bushes. Her clothes were thrown into a raspberry tree near the stadium on the Staromoskovsky Road. Then Fefilov left. Yakupova's disappearance was not immediately reported because she was far from home and the people who might have noticed were not watching for her in the right places. Her body was not found until October 7, 1983, 2 full months after her death. In that 2-month gap, Fefilov returned to the crime scene 3 separate times. On August 30th, on September 23rd, and again on 8 or October 9th, the day after her body was finally discovered. What drove him back remains a matter of forensic psychology rather than confirmed record, but investigators who later analyzed his pattern described it as a form of ownership, a compulsion to revisit what he had done. He went back to her in the bushes. He went back to the place where he had left her clothes in the branches. He had made the location his in some grotesque private sense, and he returned to it the way a person returns to somewhere they feel they belong. The investigation into Yakupova's murder turned toward the people closest to her in Sverdlovsk. Neighbors in her hostel reported that she had complained about a man named Mikhail Titov, who had been persistently pursuing her with unwanted attention. At the end of May 1984, nearly a year after Yakupova's death, Titov was detained after being observed harassing women on the street. He was already registered at a psychoneurological dispensary, which in Soviet terms meant he was the kind of man the system expected to find guilty of something. Titov was forced to confess. His confession, like Khabarov's before it, disintegrated under any serious examination. He constantly changed his account. He could not identify the crime scene. He could not explain what had been done with the items taken from the deceased. There was a witness who claimed to have seen Titov near the murder location on the relevant day, and investigators later discovered that this witness was registered at the city's psychiatric hospital. The testimony of a psychiatric patient used to convict a man of murder in a case where the real killer was still walking the streets. Before any trial could conclude, Titov died in custody. He had received numerous injuries during his detention. He was transferred to the prison hospital, where he did not survive. A senior prison official was removed from his post as a consequence. The murder cases of both Gulnara Yakupova and the next victim, Natasha Lapshina, were officially closed. Reason: death of the accused. Natasha Lapshina had been murdered on May 11, 1984, less than 9 months after Yakupova. She was another 5th-grade pupil from school number 41, the same school as Lena Mangasheva, murdered 2 years earlier not far from the same spot. She was not far from the Kontrolnaya bus stop. Fefilov had not moved far. The forest belt still functioned as his territory, his operational ground, a place that had already yielded 2 victims and had produced no consequence for him. What he did to Natasha Lapshina was worse than what he had done before. He raped her, he strangled her, and then he desecrated her corpse, inserting a stick into her genitals. He threw her body into a water-filled ditch. He scattered her clothing across the country road. He took a case filled with markers from her rucksack, a child's art supplies, carried away as a trophy by a man who had just destroyed a child. Her body was found the next day. The ditch was not deep. The clothing, scattered across open ground, was visible. Fefilov had not been especially careful. He did not need to be especially careful, because the system that should have been hunting him was busy processing the fabricated confession of Mikhail Titov and closing cases that should have remained open. The pattern that connected these murders was visible to at least one man within the Sverdlovsk police structure. Senior security officer Yuri Kokovikin had been watching the accumulating cases near the Kontrolnaya bus stop. The similarities between the killings were not subtle. The location, the method of strangulation, the sexual assault, the deliberate post-mortem acts, the scattering of clothing and removal of small items as trophies. Kokovikin compiled his analysis, wrote a formal report, and submitted it to his superiors. He proposed the creation of a unified investigative group with a single operational focus. Find the one person responsible for all of these deaths. His report was rejected. Not reconsidered, not tabled for review, rejected. And then, in a development that reveals exactly how deeply the institutional pride of the Sverdlovsk police had infected the investigation, a counter-theory was proposed. That Kokovikin himself had committed the murders and was manufacturing the single-killer theory to protect himself. He was removed from the investigation. Not long after, he was dismissed from the police entirely. The man who had come closest to understanding what was happening in the Ural Forest Belt was expelled from the only position from which he could have done anything about it. On May 6, 1985, Larissa Diachuk, 21 years old, a student at an art and technical school, was raped and strangled near the lakeside of the Staromoskovsky Road. Fefilov desecrated her corpse with the same method as Lapshina. He did not hide the body. He scattered her clothing and belongings around the crime scene. From her, he took a gold ring, a medallion, a wristwatch, and a medical scalpel. Her body was found on May 17th. Within a month, two brothers named Yashkin, both underage, were arrested and compelled to confess to Diachuk's murder. They also named two acquaintances as alleged accomplices. All four individuals were held. The Yashkin brothers remained in custody until the autumn of 1985, when investigators were ultimately unable to fabricate a sufficient case against them, and they were released without charge. Then a fireman named Ivan Antropov, who worked for a forestry enterprise, was arrested on suspicion of the same murder. The evidence against him was a patch of paint found on his jacket, which forensic experts initially claimed was chemically identical to paint found among Diachuk's belongings. A re-examination established that the paint samples shared no common genetic basis, meaning they had come from entirely different sources. Despite this, Antropov's case was brought to court twice. Twice it was returned for further investigation. He remained imprisoned for 10 months in pretrial detention before the arrival of a new murder finally forced investigators to confront the reality that they had the wrong man. The new murder made that confrontation unavoidable. But by then, Fefilov had committed his fifth killing, and the Sverdlovsk law enforcement apparatus had managed to imprison, torture, and execute innocent people while leaving him entirely undisturbed. By 1986, Nikolai Fefilov had been killing in the same general area of Sverdlovsk for 4 years. He had murdered 4 people: a schoolgirl, a young factory worker and student, another schoolgirl, an art student. And the Soviet investigative machine had, in response, executed 1 innocent man, beaten another to death in custody, imprisoned 2 underage boys, and jailed a fireman for nearly a year. No one had come close to Fefilov. He had not been questioned. He had not been placed in a lineup. His name had not appeared on any list. He went to work at the Ural Worker printing house and came home to his daughters, and the city that should have been hunting him had no idea he existed. On May 26, 1986, Olga Timofeeva became his 5th victim. She was a student at the Ural State Medical University, a young woman studying medicine in a city that could not protect her from its own resident predator. Fefilov attacked her near the same stadium on the Staromoskovsky tract that had featured in earlier crimes. He raped her, he strangled her, and then he went further than he had gone before. He desecrated her corpse with the stick method, as he had done with his previous victims. But this time he also cut off her breasts. He covered her body with branches. He took a wristwatch, a gold ring set with a stone, and her sports trousers. Timofeeva's body was found 2 days later. The murder of a medical university student produced renewed pressure from the Sverdlovsk Regional Party Committee. This was not merely a police matter anymore, it was a political embarrassment. An unknown killer was operating in the Verkhisetsky district, and the party leadership needed results. Considerable investigative resources were redirected to the Kontrolnaya bus stop area. Police officers were deployed daily in operational patrols and ambushes. Old cases were pulled from files and reviewed. Psychoneurological dispensaries across the city were checked for individuals who might fit a profile. But the search still had no coherent center. Kokovikin's single killer theory, the only analytical framework that actually corresponded to reality, had been rejected and its author expelled from the force. In his absence, the investigation operated with no unified strategy. Resources were deployed without a consistent thesis about what they were looking for. It was the kind of investigation that moves a great deal without going anywhere, that generates paperwork and patrols and press briefings without producing the essential insight that reorients the entire enterprise. Fefilov read the pressure correctly. He was not a man of particular genius, but he was a man of animal instinct sharpened by years of predatory experience in a city that had repeatedly failed to perceive him. He understood, in practical terms, that the concentration of police activity around the Kontrolnaya bus stop made it dangerous. He stopped hunting there. He did not stop hunting. He moved. The next killing occurred in a different part of the city entirely. The Zeleznodorozhny district, near the Viz train station, was his new ground. On May 22, 1987, he found Elena Kuk there. She was 19 years old. He raped her. He strangled her with a belt. He desecrated her corpse with the stick, and then he cut off her breasts, as he had done to Timofeeva the year before. He threw her body into bushes near a railway embankment, where it was found the following day. 3 people were arrested. The first was a man named Galiev, described in case documents as mentally challenged. The second was a man named Karasyov. Notably, a man who had been suspected of the earlier Diachuk murder in 1985 on the improbable grounds that he had been the one to discover the body. The third was a man named Vodiankin, also described as mentally challenged. All 3 under interrogation, a word that in the context of Soviet criminal procedure requires no further elaboration, confessed to the murder of Elena Kuk. Vodiankin went further. He confessed to all 4 prior murders at the Kontrolnaya bus stop. Investigators had managed, by this point, to extract confessions for every murder in the series from people who had committed none of them. The system that was supposed to stop Nikolai Fefilov had instead become a machine for producing false confessions from people least equipped to resist the pressure that produced them. The intellectually disabled, the mentally ill, the young, the vulnerable. The pattern is not accidental. These were the individuals who lacked the legal literacy, the social standing, and the personal resilience to withstand extended interrogation in Soviet detention. The same human qualities that made them easy to overlook on the street made them easy to exploit in a cell. While the cases against Galiev, Karasyov, and Vodiankin proceeded through the Soviet legal system, Fefilov was at home. He was going to work. He was, in all likelihood, reading about himself in the newspaper he helped print, in the articles that mentioned police progress against the Kontrolnaya killer without ever naming the actual man responsible. The investigation had by now spanned 5 years. 7 people, Khabarov, the Yashkin brothers, their named accomplices, Antropov, Titov, and now this new group, had been imprisoned, coerced, broken, or killed in connection with crimes they had not committed. The real killer remained unnamed, unchecked, and free to move through a city that was actively assuring its citizens that the danger had been contained. Fefilov did not feel contained. He felt, if his behavior in this period tells us anything, emboldened. He had changed districts when necessary, proven adaptable, demonstrated that he could operate across different zones of the city without triggering the recognition that might finally connect him to the string of deaths. His crimes were escalating in brutality. The additional mutilations of recent victims showed a predator who was not pulling back, not becoming cautious, but deepening his engagement with the violence he was committing. In 1988, he moved again. This time to the Oktyabrski district. He chose new hunting ground, the Mayakovsky Central Park of Culture and Rest, a public park in the heart of the city, a place where ordinary citizens went for ordinary leisure. He had moved from forest belts on the city's edge to a park that functioned as part of daily civic life. The geographic escalation mirrored the escalation in his crimes. He was no longer hiding at the margins. He was operating inside the city itself. On April 25, 1988, he found his final victim in that park. She was a young woman. He attempted to rape her. He strangled her. The method never varied, never evolved into anything more elaborate than the direct application of force to the throat, a method as intimate as it was lethal. He took a wristwatch, a purse containing money, a gold ring, and the woman's glasses. He began trying to conceal the body. He did not finish. Yevgeny Mordvyanik was a senior lieutenant of the Internal Service of the Interior Ministry. On April 25, 1988, he happened to be near the Mayakovsky Park in the Oktyabrski district when he saw something wrong. The details of exactly what drew his attention, a sound, a movement, something incongruent in the landscape of the park, are not preserved in the record with precision. What is preserved is the consequence. Mordvyanik moved toward what he had seen. He found Nikolai Fefilov attempting to hide the body of his seventh victim. Mordvyanik detained him on the spot. 6 years, 7 murders, an unknown number of innocent people destroyed by the system that failed to find the man who had just been caught. Not by investigative brilliance, not by forensic analysis, not by the patient application of any of the resources that had been deployed so loudly and so fruitlessly across the city, but by chance. By a single officer happening to be in the right place at the right moment in a public park. That is how the Ural Strangler was caught. Fefilov was taken into custody on April 25, 1988. He was 41 years old. He had been married for years, had raised 2 daughters, had reported to work at the Ural Worker newspaper through every season of his killing, had attended whatever ordinary social and domestic events formed the texture of a Soviet working man's life, and no one, not his wife, not his colleagues, not his neighbors in the communal apartment, not any of the investigators who had been pouring resources into the Kontrolnaya bus stop area since 1982, had identified him as the source of the deaths that had been accumulating in the forest belt. On May 7, 1988, the newspaper Sovetskaya Rossiya published a brief notice. A serial killer had been arrested in Sverdlovsk. The information reached the public in that characteristically compressed Soviet style. Minimal detail, controlled framing, the suggestion of triumph over darkness without the context that would explain how darkness had been permitted to operate for so long. From Moscow, 2 senior investigators flew to Sverdlovsk. Viktor Pantelei and Vladimir Parshikov were investigators for particularly important cases under the prosecutor's office of the RSFSR, the kind of rank deployed when a matter had already grown beyond the capacity of local authorities to manage alone. Their arrival was itself a signal of how serious the case had become, and how deeply the local law enforcement apparatus had compromised itself. Fefilov began to talk. He did not resist confession. He went through the killings one by one: Lena Mangasheva in April 1982, Gulnara Yakupova in August 1983, Natasha Lapshina in May 1984, Larissa Diachuk in May 1985, Olga Timofeeva in May 1986, Elena Kuk in May 1987, and the final victim in April 1988. He confirmed the details that only the real killer would know. He led investigators through the sequence of events with a precision that matched the physical evidence at each scene in ways no fabricated confession had ever managed. During investigative reconstructions at the crime scenes, formal exercises in Soviet criminal procedure in which a suspect reenacts events at the location where they occurred, Fefilov produced something the Khabarov investigation had never been able to produce. A genuine result. A portfolio belonging to Lena Mangasheva, which had disappeared in 1982 and never been found during the original investigation, was recovered during one of these reconstructions. Fefilov knew where it was because he had put it there. Khabarov had not known where it was because he had never touched it. Forensic psychiatric evaluation was conducted. The examiners found that Fefilov was legally sane. Not psychotic, not disconnected from reality, not operating under delusional compulsion in any way that would diminish criminal responsibility under Soviet law. He understood what he was doing. He had understood it all along. The printer who set type for the newspaper and went home to his daughters had been sane throughout every hour of every crime. A search of his apartment and his workplace at the printing house produced the most damning physical evidence of all. The belongings of his victims, which he had kept. Watches, rings, a medallion, a scalpel, items taken from women and girls who were dead. These objects were identified by the families and friends of the deceased. People who had been living for years with the knowledge that someone had taken their sister, their daughter, their friend, and had never been brought to account. The identifications confirmed what Fefilov's own confessions had already established. The investigation into the murder series had done severe damage to the reputation of Sverdlovsk law enforcement. The exposure of what had been done, the fabricated cases, the coerced confessions, the execution of an innocent man, made any forthcoming trial the kind of public reckoning that Soviet institutional culture was fundamentally designed to avoid. A trial in which Fefilov testified in open court would necessarily mean testimony about what had been done to Khabarov, to Titov, to the Yashkin brothers, to Antropov, to the 3 men arrested after Elena Kuk's murder. It would mean a formal record of systemic failure at every level of the Sverdlovsk criminal justice apparatus. It would mean names and ranks attached to decisions that had sent an innocent man to a firing squad. The leadership of the Sverdlovsk police and prosecutor's office, confronted with this prospect, faced a calculation that was, in the context of Soviet institutional logic, not a difficult one. Fefilov was in custody. He was sane, confessed, and surrounded by physical evidence. He was also the most dangerous witness that the Sverdlovsk criminal justice system had ever been forced to produce. Every word he said in court would be, in a different sense, an indictment of the people who had failed to stop him. Every detail of the fabricated investigations would emerge through cross-examination. The executed man's name would be spoken aloud in a courtroom, and someone in the Sverdlovsk Regional Party Committee, or the prosecutor's office, or the Department of Internal Affairs, decided that this could not be permitted to happen. On August 30th, 1988, Nikolai Borisovich Fefilov was strangled in his prison cell. The official account described a quarrel with his cellmate. No further details were offered. The investigation into his death, conducted by senior investigators from the RSFSR prosecutor's office, the same Moscow-level authority that had sent Panteliai and Parshikov to oversee the serial murder investigation, concluded without finding sufficient evidence to prove that the killing had been ordered from above. Officially, it was a prison altercation. The case against Nikolai Fefilov was terminated on October 25, 1988, by reason of his death. The man who strangled 7 people in the Ural city of Sverdlovsk was himself strangled in a Soviet jail. He was 42 years old. He never faced a jury. He never stood before the families of his victims. He never had to look at the relatives of Georgy Khabarov and account for the fact that his freedom had cost an innocent man his life. The rehabilitation of Georgy Khabarov came in 1989, the year after Fefilov died. He was posthumously cleared of the murder of Lena Mangasheva, the legal system acknowledging, in the only form it permitted itself, that it had executed the wrong man. Khabarov did not live to know this. He had been dead for 5 years. None of the Sverdlovsk law enforcement officers responsible for fabricating the cases against Khabarov or the other wrongfully accused individuals were ever prosecuted. The deputy chief of the Verkhaisetsky District Department of Internal Affairs, a colonel named Shirikov, was identified as bearing some responsibility for the misconduct. The criminal investigator Kabanov, named alongside him, had died before accountability could be formally assigned. No one served a day in prison for the coercion, the false confessions, or the execution of a man they knew, or should have known, had not committed the crime. The officers who had destroyed Kokovikin's career for correctly identifying a serial killer received no sanction. What remained when everything settled was the simplest possible accounting. 7 women and girls were murdered between April 1982 and April 1988 in Sverdlovsk, Soviet Union, by a married father of 2 who worked at a local newspaper and returned to the same forest belt again and again because no one was looking for him there with sufficient care or clarity. At least 1 innocent man was executed for his crimes. At least 1 other died in custody under torture. Several more spent months or years in detention they should never have endured. The real killer was caught by accident and killed in a cell before he could testify. The Ural Mountains stand today over what is now the city of Ekaterinburg. The forest belt near the Staromoskovsky Road is still there, older now, the trees taller, the light filtering through the same way it did in April 1982 when Lena Mangasheva walked into it and did not walk out. The Kontrolnaya bus stop still exists. People still pass through that area the way people always have, without stopping, without looking too carefully at the ground between the trees, without knowing what the ground there has held. The elusive predator, the Ural strangler, the necrophile of Sverdlovsk. Nikolai Borisovich Fefilov left behind no manifesto, no explanation, no coherent account of what drove him from the communal apartment to the forest belt with homicide in mind. What he left behind was a set of trophies in a drawer, rings and watches and a child's pencil case, and a city that had reorganized its entire criminal justice apparatus around the project of not finding him, sacrificing innocent people to protect an institutional reputation that the truth, when it finally came, destroyed completely anyway. The Soviet system that created Fefilov's invisibility died 3 years after he did. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics dissolved in 1991, taking with it the machinery of suppression and denial that had allowed a serial killer to operate for 6 years in a closed city while the state executed someone else for his crimes. What did not dissolve were the graves. Lena Mangasheva, Gulnara Yakupova, Natasha Lapshina, Larissa Diachuk, Olga Timofeeva, Elena Kuk, the 7th victim, whose name is recorded in some case summaries and absent from others. 7 names for 7 lives, against which the entire apparatus of Soviet criminal justice had failed in every way a justice system can fail. Not just by failing to catch the killer, but by actively ensuring that catching him remained impossible. That is the legacy of the Ural strangler. Not just the murders. The murders are the surface. Beneath them is the deeper story of a system so committed to its own infallibility that it preferred to execute the innocent rather than admit it could not find the guilty. Of a single honest officer, Kokovikin, who saw the truth clearly and was punished for it. Of an institutional rot so thorough that when the truth finally arrived in the form of a caught and confessing killer, those responsible found it easier to have him strangled quietly in a cell than to let the courtroom hear what he had to say. Nikolai Fefilov killed 7 people. The system that failed to stop him destroyed several more. And when the man himself became inconvenient, the system destroyed him too, then closed the file, walked away, and let the forest keep its silence. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Leningrad Strangler. Vasily Efimovich Filippenko, aka Steel Fingers, the ghost of the Obvodny Canal, absolute evil. He hunted women in the dark, helped police search for himself in the morning, and left 5 bodies in the water and dust of Leningrad before anyone knew his name. There are men who wear evil like a second skin. Invisible, seamless, undetectable men who shake your hand at sunrise and take a life before the moon rises again. Vasily Filippenko was that man. A man who patrolled the very streets where he left women dead. A man who looked his colleagues in the eye and discussed the monster they were hunting. The monster was him. Picture a city draped in the cold gray fabric of Soviet silence. Leningrad, 1967. The Obvodny Canal runs like a dark vein through the heart of the city. Long, lightless, and indifferent. Young women walk its banks every night. They always have. Feels safe enough. There are Druzhiniks, volunteer officers of the people, patrolling these very streets. Order, structure, the Soviet promise. But something has gone wrong in the shadows near the water. Women are being beaten, violated, and strangled with bare hands so powerful the very bones inside their throats are crushed. No weapon, no blade, just hands, wrapped around a throat until there is nothing left but silence and a body left in the dark like a discarded secret. And the man doing it? He is wearing a Drazinic armband. He is one of the men assigned to protect these women. He is walking these same paths, scanning these same faces, listening to the same radio reports about himself, and privately, coldly, enjoying every moment of it. His name is Vasily Efimovich Filippenko. And before this story ends, 5 women will be dead, 2 innocent men will rot in prison for crimes they never committed, and a corrupt Soviet machine will try to bury the truth under falsified paperwork and political pressure. This is not fiction. This is Leningrad. This is real. And it is about to get so much darker. To understand what Vasily Filippenko became, you must first understand what broke him. Because men like him do not appear from nothing. They are built, piece by fractured piece, from disappointment, injury, and the kind of private bitterness that hardens like concrete inside a chest until it becomes something unrecognizable, something dangerous. He was born in 1936 in Kerch, a port city perched on the eastern tip of Crimea, where the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov collide. Kerch was a city of industry, of working hands, of men who carried their weight on their backs and never spoke about what they carried inside. It was the kind of place that built physical strength without necessarily nurturing emotional depth. Filippenko grew up there. He spent his first 30 years in that port city, becoming, like many men of his era and environment, a man of labor, a crane operator, a man of steel and machinery of height and mechanical precision. He knew how to handle weight. He understood force. He understood, perhaps more than most, exactly how much pressure it takes before something gives way. Then one day, and no one can say exactly which day, which shift, which moment of distraction, the crane gave way beneath him. He fell. The impact with the ground below was catastrophic. 17 fractures. 17. His body was shattered. The bones that had supported him through 3 decades of physical labor splintered apart in a single fall. He was rushed to hospital, placed in a bed, and left to wait, surrounded by the sounds of recovery, by the dull ache of broken things trying to knit themselves back together. His wife came to visit at first. Then the visits became less frequent. Then they stopped. She had drawn her own conclusions, the kind that practical people draw when survival instinct overrides loyalty. She believed he would never walk properly again. She believed he would be a burden. She believed, perhaps, that her future deserved more than a disabled man in a hospital bed. And so she did what she decided she had to do. She filed for divorce. That decision changed everything. Not because divorce itself is a catastrophic event, though in Soviet society it carried its own stigma, but because of the timing. The man in the bed, already broken physically, watched his marriage dissolve while he was still unable to move. He experienced abandonment at the exact moment of maximum vulnerability. The wound that was left was not in his bones. The bones, remarkably, healed. 17 fractures, and Vasily Filippenko recovered, against expectation, against odds, against the prediction that had driven his wife to leave. He stood up. He walked. He returned to the world physically whole. But something else did not heal. Something curdled in the place where trust in a woman had lived. His ex-wife had left him at his lowest point, and whatever warmth or understanding he had once extended toward the opposite sex quietly rotted into something else. Hostility, not the loud, obvious kind, the silent kind, the kind that wears a normal face and a calm voice while something corrosive works beneath the surface. He did not broadcast his feelings. He did not become visibly aggressive or erratic. At work, he was described by colleagues as dependable, positive, a good worker. He gave no indication, not a single visible warning, of what was growing inside him. In 1966, he made a decision that would give that darkness a stage. He left Kerch and moved to Leningrad, one of the Soviet Union's great cities, a place of culture, bridges, rivers, canals, and millions of people flowing through its wide streets and narrow alleys. He found work at a port in Leningrad, once again as a crane operator. He was given a room in a dormitory, a propiska, the Soviet residency permit that tethered him officially to the city. He blended in with the city's workforce effortlessly. Nobody looked at Vasily Filippenko and felt uneasy. Nobody looked at him at all, really. He was just another working man in a city full of them. And he joined the voluntary people's Druzina. This fact is essential. The Druziniks were civilian volunteers who assisted law enforcement in maintaining public order. They wore armbands. They walked the streets. They helped patrol areas where crime was suspected. They worked alongside police. They were trusted by the community, by the state, and by the people they encountered on the streets at night. Joining the Druzina was, for many Soviet men, an act of genuine civic commitment. For Filipenko, it was something else. It was access. It was a uniform of respectability. It was a reason to be on the streets at night without suspicion. It was, in a sense, the perfect cover for what he was becoming. The Obvodny Canal ran through his territory. A long, dark stretch of urban waterway, industrial in character, flanked by factory buildings and workers' hostels, by hospital grounds and residential blocks. At night, it was a place of shadows and solitude. Young women walked along its banks going home from late shifts, from evenings out, from the company of friends or companions. They walked in the way that people walk in places that feel familiar. Not on guard, not scanning the dark, not imagining that the man on the bridge above in a hat and a raincoat was watching them with something more than passing indifference. Filipenko had been watching, and in May of 1967, he stopped watching and started acting. The night of May 23rd to 24th. That was when it began. A 19-year-old factory worker named Nina Pedakova had spent the evening with a sailor she'd been seeing, a merchant seaman named Sergei Sergeyev. She worked at the Red Triangle factory, one of Leningrad's well-known industrial plants. She was young and alive and entirely ordinary in the way that young women are ordinary, which means she was irreplaceable. The evening ended when she and Sergeyev parted ways on the embankment of the Obvodny Canal. He headed back to his ship. She stayed a moment longer on the embankment. Filipenko was there. In his own later testimony, he described the encounter with a coldness that investigators found deeply disturbing. He said she approached him herself, though this claim was characteristic of the way he framed his crimes, always repositioning himself as a passive participant in events he entirely orchestrated. What is known is that he led her, or followed her, to the grounds of a round-the-clock kindergarten near the canal, located adjacent to the women's dormitory of the Red Triangle plant. In the shadow of that building, among the swings and small benches and spaces designed for children's daylight hours, he attacked her. He later told investigators, in a moment of chilling specificity, that when he looked at her, she reminded him of his ex-wife. That was the trigger. That face, that young woman's face, carrying some echo of the woman who had abandoned him in a hospital bed. He beat her, he raped her, and then he wrapped his hands around her throat and he squeezed until Nina Pedakova was no longer alive. The duty teachers at the kindergarten heard screams that night. They heard them and dismissed them. Perhaps the sounds of a lover's quarrel, perhaps a woman who'd had too much to drink, perhaps nothing worth getting up and investigating. And so they turned over and the screaming stopped, and by morning Nina Pedakova was dead and the kindergarten opened for another ordinary day. When investigators arrived, they found 2 hairs clutched in Nina's right hand, hairs that did not belong to her. The forensic examination retrieved the killer's biological material, establishing his blood type. These were the first threads, but the investigation made its first catastrophic error almost immediately. Suspicion fell on Sergeyev, the sailor who had spent the evening with her. He was the last known person to have seen her alive. He had returned to his ship after parting from her, but timing was scrutinized, alibis were questioned, and Sergeyev was brought in for questioning. The investigation should have ended there, because the forensic evidence was clear. Sergeyev's blood type and hair samples did not match the killer's. The kindergarten teachers confirmed that Pedakova's screams had been heard around midnight, a full hour after she and Sergeyev had parted, and the ship's journal confirmed he had been on board by then. Additionally, Sergeyev himself provided a detail that investigators should have treated as gold. Before leaving Pedakova, he had seen a man on the bridge over the Obvodny Canal, wearing a hat and a raincoat. That man was Filipenko. But in Soviet investigative culture, where closing a case quickly was valued more highly than closing it correctly. These facts were inconvenient and so were, for the moment, minimized. Sergeyev was released, but the investigation had already developed its habit of looking in the wrong direction. Filippenko was free. He was still wearing his Druzinic armband. He was still walking the streets alongside the officers trying to identify him, and in the months that followed, he was not idle. By July, he struck again. His second victim also encountered him near the Avadny Canal at night. He had arranged the meeting as if it were a rendezvous, something casual, something anticipated. Near her home, he attacked her. He beat her. He strangled her unconscious. He raped her. But this time, for reasons that remain unclear, perhaps he was interrupted, perhaps something broke in his rhythm. He did not kill her. She survived, unconscious in the dark, but breathing. This surviving victim would become both the investigation's greatest asset and, through no fault of her own, one of its greatest liabilities. She had seen him. She could identify him. The investigators worked from her description to build a pool of suspects from the passport records of men living in the Avadny Canal area. And they showed her photographs. She picked one, a 24-year-old worker named Igor Vorobiev. Igor Vorobiev was innocent. His blood type, when tested, happened to match the killer's. His hair samples did not. The hair evidence should have ended it there. It hadn't matched Sergeyev and it didn't match Vorobiev, and a competent investigation would have recognized the pattern. But the blood type coincidence was enough. Vorobiev was arrested. His wife insisted he had been home that night. Her testimony was dismissed. And in the months between Vorobiev's arrest and his eventual trial, Filippenko committed 2 more attacks, a fact that the investigators chose, consciously, not to connect to the ongoing case. The blood type matching a man already in custody was declared coincidental. Vorobiev was convicted of rape and sentenced to 6 years in a Soviet prison, screaming his innocence into walls that did not listen. And Filippenko walked free, armband on, into the autumn of 1967. The city of Leningrad did not know what was among them. The investigation was compromised by its own urgency, by political pressure from the city's Communist Party leadership, by the Soviet bureaucratic refusal to admit error. And so the stage was set for everything that followed. The bodies that would pile up, the women who would not come home, the families left to demand answers from officials who were burying the truth as fast as it surfaced. Leningrad was in the grip of something it couldn't name and didn't want to admit. The Avadny Canal ran dark and cold, and somewhere along its banks, a man in a Druzinic armband was already thinking about his next victim. The first kill was done. But Vasily Filippenko, the Leningrad strangler, steel fingers, absolute evil, had only just begun. Autumn in Leningrad carries a particular weight. The light flattens early and vanishes fast. The streets turn cold with a damp that settles into the bones of buildings and into the bones of the people moving through them. The Avadny Canal reflects a pewter sky, and the women who walk its banks in the fading afternoon light of October pull their coats tighter and walk a little faster. They do not know why exactly. It is the sensation that cities develop during seasons of violence. A collective, wordless unease that spreads without explanation. Leningrad in the autumn of 1967 had it. People felt it without being able to name its source. Filippenko knew exactly what its source was. He had put it there. With Igor Vorobiev imprisoned for a crime he never committed, and with the investigation having effectively closed itself off to the truth by insisting the canal killings were unrelated or resolved, Filippenko moved with something approaching impunity. The pressure on him was not the pressure of being suspected, it was the pressure of appetite. He had tasted something in May of 1967, something dark and absolute in that kindergarten ground beside the canal, and the months that followed had not extinguished it. They had stoked it. His third killing took place on the grounds of the Bakin Hospital, a target of terrible irony, given that hospitals exist as the last wall between human life and extinction. Tatiana Kuznetsova was 25 years old. She was a nurse, working a night duty shift, responsible for the care and safety of patients who depended on her. She was in a place that should have been, if any place could be, a sanctuary. But the hospital grounds at night were dark, and Filippenko was already inside those grounds, because he had been chasing someone else. This detail is important and tells you something about the way he operated. He was not a man who identified one specific victim and planned with careful precision. He was a predator moving through the dark, scanning for opportunity, for a woman isolated enough, for a moment vulnerable enough. He had been pursuing another woman on the hospital grounds and lost her. She stepped into one of the buildings and the moment passed. He did not leave. He adapted. He found Tatiana Kuznetsova in the hospital courtyard, alone on her shift. And he did to her what he had done to Nina Pedakova. He beat her, violated her, and strangled the life from her with his bare hands. But this time he took something. Unlike the first killing, where he had left the victim's belongings untouched, he reached into Tatiana's handbag and took her money. This was a behavioral shift, minor in scale, enormous in what it revealed. The violence was not yet entirely bound to a single motive. He was capable of expanding his actions, of adding dimensions to the crime. It made him more unpredictable and, in investigative terms, slightly harder to profile. The woman he had originally pursued that night, the one who escaped into a Botkin hospital building, noticed she was being followed. She went to the police the next morning and reported it. Her application was not accepted. In the Soviet investigative culture of the era, a report from a woman who had not technically been attacked and who could not provide a satisfying level of detail was considered insufficient to act on. The officer likely made a note, likely did nothing, and Tatiana Kuznetsova's case was handled initially as an isolated event. The hospital staff and patients were checked. The usual inquiries were made, before investigators eventually noticed the similarity in method and location to the Pedakova case. The Botkin hospital was not on the Avadny Canal, but it was nearby, and the signature was unmistakable. Rape followed by manual strangulation. The connection was made. The cases were linked. The investigation widened. But the investigation was chasing a ghost. Because by the time the connection was officially acknowledged, October had arrived, and with October came the flood. Leningrad flooded with some regularity, its geography at the mouth of the Neva River making it susceptible to storm surges and rising water. On the night of October 18th, a flood moved through the city's streets, filling the lower channels, pushing water across the embankments, emptying Leningrad of its usual foot traffic. The city was practically deserted. The streets that normally carried their quotient of workers, students, and couples returning home after the evening were empty, wet, silent. Only a few people moved through the waterlogged dark, and one of them was Filippenko. He found Galina Ivanova on the embankment of the Avadny Canal. She was there in the flood, in the extraordinary emptiness of that night, and he was there with her. He dragged her to a nearby construction site, the bones of an unfinished building, open to the sky and to the rain, a place of raw concrete and exposed rebar and scaffolding still waiting for the walls that would eventually enclose it. In that skeletal darkness, he raped Galina Ivanova and strangled her with her own tights. Her own clothing became the instrument of her death. He used what she wore against her. He left her there, in the unfinished building on the flood-soaked ground, and walked back out into the night. The discovery of Galina Ivanova's body sparked a different kind of urgency. After the third murder, investigators had already begun expanding their sweep, checking men previously convicted of sexual offenses, examining the records of those registered in psychoneurological dispensaries, looking for anyone with a history of violence toward women in the canal area. Now, after the fourth body, the Leningrad City Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union authorized a rare step. Limited public information could be published in newspapers and broadcast on the radio about the criminal situation in the city. This was not full disclosure. The Soviet state was deeply averse to acknowledging internal violence on a scale that might disturb the image of an orderly socialist society, but it was an acknowledgement that something serious was happening, and that the public needed some level of warning. Patrols along the Avadny Canal were increased. Officers and volunteer Drziniks were deployed in greater numbers. Attempts were made to catch the killer using plainclothes female officers as decoys, a tactic known informally as live bait. Women walking the canal alone at night under covert surveillance, hoping to draw the predator into a situation where he could be caught. Filippenko knew about all of this. He was part of the patrol. He heard the briefings. He walked alongside officers who were describing the man they were looking for. He helped organize the very searches that should have led to his arrest. And he continued killing. In late October, he attacked a young woman named Fina Anchak, a student at the Leningrad Technological Institute. He found her near her home. He raped her and then attempted to strangle her, but the strangulation was, forensically speaking, different from his previous attacks. This time, something specific happened inside her body. His hands, those crane operators' hands that had spent decades operating under tension and pressure, closed around her throat with a force that fractured her hyoid bone. The small, delicate U-shaped bone that sits at the base of the tongue and plays a central role in swallowing, speaking, and breathing. When the hyoid fractures, the tissue surrounding it swells. The airway narrows. The trachea, compressed from outside and now further obstructed by swelling tissue, constricts until no air can pass. Fina Anchak could not call for help. Her voice was gone. Not because she was dead, but because her throat had been structurally destroyed in a way that made speech and breath almost impossible. She lay where he left her, and the swelling continued its work, and Fina Anchak died from suffocation in a place where she should have been safe, within reach of help that never came because she could not make a sound. This killing, perhaps more than any of the others, illustrates the specific industrial horror of Filippenko's hands. He was not a man who used weapons because he did not need them. His body was the weapon. Those hands, forged by years of operating steel machinery, closing around a human throat with the casual efficiency of a mechanism designed to crush and compress. His nickname, Steel Fingers, did not come from nowhere. The death of Fina Anchak caused direct political eruption. The party leadership of Leningrad, already uncomfortable with the ongoing crisis, now delivered an ultimatum to the prosecutor's office and the police. Find the criminal within 3 days. 3 days. The political pressure that had already distorted the investigation now intensified to the point where truth became secondary to resolution. Not the truth necessarily, but a resolution, something the party could announce. A name attached to the crime. A case marked closed. That pressure produced Viktor Danilov. In early November, on Nevsky Prospect, Leningrad's Grand Main Avenue, Druzhiniks detained a 26-year-old man named Viktor Danilov for harassing women on the street. He was described as belonging to the Golden Youth. His father held a senior position in the city's construction sector. His mother was a prominent doctor. He himself had no job, living on family privilege in a system that officially condemned parasitism. He also, investigators would discover, had an intellectual disability. But in the frantic political climate of those weeks, none of these facts provided the protection they should have. A search of Danilov's apartment turned up pornographic magazines and something deeply unsettling. A collection of curls of female hair, cut from women he had pestered and molested on the street. He was a predator of a different kind, intrusive, disturbing, a man who violated women's personal space and cut pieces of them away as souvenirs. He was brought in for questioning about the canal killings. The surviving victim from July was brought in to look at him. She identified him as a man who had approached and molested her on the same day she encountered Filippenko. But she was clear that this man had approached her before meeting the killer, not during the attack. The two incidents were separate, but the investigator handling the identification refused to accept this. He pressured the woman to alter her testimony. Under that pressure, she changed her account. For the third time in the investigation, she confirmed an identification that aligned with what the investigators needed to hear rather than what she had actually experienced. Danilov's blood type was tested. It happened coincidentally to match the killer's blood type. His hair samples were not considered carefully enough. Under sustained pressure from investigators who needed a name to deliver to the party leadership, Viktor Danilov, a man with an intellectual disability who did not fully understand the process closing around him, signed a written confession to attacking women in the Obvodny Canal area. The party leadership of Leningrad announced that the maniac had been captured. There was relief. The patrols were reduced. The live bait operations were stood down. The case was being processed. And somewhere in the city, wearing a face of composed normalcy, Vasily Filippenko received the news that another man had been arrested for his crimes. He did not stop. He did not run. He did not feel gratitude or relief in any human sense. He simply continued. He found Valentina Stanikova, a young woman who worked in a fish shop. He attacked her in the familiar pattern, the violence, the violation, the hands around the throat. But this time he did something he had not done before. When Valentina Stanikova was dead, he carried her to the Obvodny Canal and dropped her body into the water. The canal that had defined his entire hunting ground, the dark strip of water he had patrolled and prowled and used as the geography of his crimes, now became a disposal site. Valentina Stanikova sank into the cold black water and did not surface until she was found. When her body was recovered, the forensic examination was unambiguous. She had been raped and killed. The cause of death, the biological evidence, the ligature marks, it was the same man. The man who was supposedly already in custody. The man who had just been announced to the party as captured. Filippenko had not only killed again. He had proven, with a body in a canal, that the case was still wide open. Fearing the political catastrophe of admitting this, the authorities made a decision so corrupt it defies belief. The forensic results were falsified. The reference to rape was removed from the official record. Instead, a new explanation was constructed. Valentina Stanikova, it was officially declared, had been intoxicated and had drowned herself. Suicide. A criminal case was denied. Her parents went to the prosecutor's office. They went to the city committee of the Communist Party. They protested. They demanded. They were turned away. Valentina Stanikova's murder was buried in a lie. And Viktor Danilov, intellectually disabled and innocent, remained in custody. And Igor Vorobiev continued serving his sentence. And Filippenko made plans. He took a trade union voucher, a state-subsidized holiday allocation, and made arrangements to travel south. He was going to Yalta. Yalta sits on the southern coast of Crimea, washed by the warm waters of the Black Sea and framed by the Crimean Mountains at its back. In the Soviet Union, it was a city of sanatoriums, state-run rest facilities where workers were sent on union-funded vouchers to recover, to relax, to receive the state's official prescription for human restoration. It was a place of convalescence and holiday, of sea air and institutional meals and the particular idleness that Soviet-authorized leisure imposed on its recipients. Filippenko arrived in early 1968 with a voucher. He was a working man on a state-sanctioned break. He was, on paper and in every visible way, exactly what the sanatorium system intended. A laboring citizen taking the recovery he had earned. He checked in. He was given a room. The Black Sea glittered outside his window, indifferent and enormous. The maid assigned to his section of the sanatorium was going about her duties, the ordinary, unextraordinary work of keeping a place in order, when Filippenko moved on her. He attacked her in the way he had refined over the course of 5 murders, with his hands, with the specific violence that had become his signature, his absolute method. He went for her throat. He went for what he always went for. But this time something was different. She fought, or he was interrupted, or the daylight conditions of a functioning sanatorium provided witnesses or noise or proximity that his Obvodny Canal nights had never offered. Whatever the precise mechanism, the attack was stopped before it became a murder. The maid survived. Filippenko was seized. He was taken to a detention center in Simferopol, the capital of Crimea, roughly in the center of the peninsula, the administrative and legal hub for the region. He was placed in a cell. And in that cell, in the enforced smallness of a shared holding space, he was not alone. His cellmate was a man who had made a different kind of arrangement with the Soviet state, an informant, a prisoner who passed information to the authorities in exchange for considerations of various kinds. These arrangements were common. Filippenko did not know about his cellmate's relationship with law enforcement, or perhaps, and this is a chilling thought, he did not care. He talked. In that cell in Simferopol, Vasily Filippenko told his cellmate what he had done in Leningrad. Not vaguely, not in hints and implications, He spoke about the murders in detail, the locations, the women, the methods, the specific facts that only the killer could know. 5 murders: the kindergarten, the hospital, the construction site on the flood night, the hyoid bone, the body in the canal. He laid it out, and his cellmate absorbed every word. The information was passed to the authorities. Leningrad was notified. Investigators were dispatched from the northern city to Simferopol, traveling the length of the country to sit across a table from a man who, by then, had been in a detention cell for weeks, and to begin the interrogation that would either confirm or destroy the cellmate's report. Filippenko confirmed everything. In the interrogation, he did not hedge or deny or retreat into silence. He spoke about the 5 Leningrad murders in the Obvodny Canal area with a level of specific detail that no outsider, no person who had not been there, who had not done these things, could possess. He described elements of each crime that had never been released publicly. He knew the precise geography of each attack. He described what each woman had been wearing. He spoke about what he had taken from Tatiana Kuznetsova's handbag. He described Galina Ivanova's tights. He described Fina Anchak's hyoid bone fracturing under his hands, not in medical terminology, but in the language of physical sensation, the feeling of something inside her throat giving way. He described throwing Valentina Stenikova's body into the canal. Every detail checked out. Every detail was already in the classified case files, known only to the investigators themselves. Filippenko was transported back to Leningrad under guard. The journey north must have been strange for him. A man returning to the city where he had hunted and killed, now in handcuffs on a train, watching the landscape transform from the warmth of Crimea to the gray industrial outskirts of Leningrad. He was taken through the city he knew as a predator and now experienced as a prisoner. The canal would have been visible at some point, perhaps. That long, dark strip of water that had defined so much of what he was. He gave no recorded indication of what he felt. In Leningrad, the investigative experiments began. This was standard Soviet procedure for a confession of this magnitude. The suspect is taken back to each crime scene and required to walk investigators through what occurred, demonstrating knowledge of the location and the specific physical details of the crime. Filippenko led investigators through the kindergarten grounds where Nina Pedikova had died. He walked them through the Botkin Hospital courtyard where Tatiana Kuznetsova had been killed. He took them to the construction site where Galina Ivanova had been left in the flood debris. He showed them where he had last been with Fina Anchak. He pointed to the section of the Obvodny Canal where Valentina Stenikova had gone into the water. At each location, he was precise, consistent. The details aligned with the physical evidence that had been gathered and stored. There was no doubt. There had never been any real doubt about what the evidence showed. The doubt had been manufactured by an investigation operating under political pressure, by officials who needed cases closed faster than the truth could be assembled, by a system that valued the appearance of resolution over the reality of justice. Now the reality of justice was unavoidable. The man was standing in the places where he had committed the murders. He was describing the murders with the authority of a man who had been there. The evidence supported every word. But the revelation of Filippenko's guilt created an immediate and severe institutional problem. Because 2 men, Igor Vorobiev and Viktor Danilov, were in custody or had been processed by the system for crimes that Filippenko had just confessed to. Vorobiev was serving a 6-year sentence for a rape that Filippenko had committed. Danilov had confessed under pressure and was awaiting the processing of a case built entirely on falsified testimony, investigative coercion, and a forensic blood type coincidence. And Valentina Stenikova's murder had been officially classified as a suicide in official documents. Documents that now stood as evidence of deliberate falsification by the very officers who had created them. The unraveling was thorough and brutal in its institutional implications. The criminal case against Danilov was discontinued and he was released. Igor Vorobiev was released from the prison where he had been serving someone else's sentence, and he was formally rehabilitated. A Soviet legal process acknowledging wrongful conviction and, in theory, restoring his reputation and civil status, though no amount of formal paperwork could return to him the years he had spent behind bars for a crime committed by the man who had been walking free the entire time. 6 employees of the prosecutor's office were dismissed for the errors committed in the investigation. 6. not criminal charges, dismissals. In a case where an innocent man had been imprisoned, where a murder had been officially reclassified as suicide to protect the system, where the forensic evidence had been suppressed and falsified, the institutional consequence was that 6 people lost their jobs. And there was one more detail, one that investigators discovered and that sent a particular chill through everyone who learned it. Throughout the period when he was actively hunting and killing women along the Obvodny Canal, Filippenko, as a member of the Voluntary People's Druzina, had been actively participating in the search for himself. He had walked alongside officers. He had received briefings about the case. He had been part of the infrastructure of the investigation that was trying to find him. He had, in the most grotesque possible way, been helping them look for the man who was standing right next to them, wearing the same armband. The investigators who had processed Sergeyev, Vorobiev, and Danilov, who had walked the canal at night looking for a predator, had walked it with the predator beside them. The psychological portrait that emerged from the investigation and the formal forensic psychiatric examination was of a man who had transformed a personal wound into a generalized homicidal fixation. His ex-wife's abandonment, her decision to leave him in a hospital bed, had not driven him to depression or to visible dysfunction. It had driven him inward, into a cold and absolute rejection of women as people deserving of the protection he was pretending to provide. Every woman who walked the canal alone at night, every woman who reminded him in some flicker of recognition of the woman who had left him, they were all, to Filippenko's internal logic, the same woman. The woman who had walked away, and he was taking back, in the most violent and permanent way, the control she had taken from him. He was not disorganized. He was not chaotic. He was methodical in his selection of environments. Always the canal area, always at night, always in spaces where darkness and isolation gave him the advantage. He read the investigation's progress through his own participation in it and adapted accordingly. When patrols increased, he did not stop, but he chose the night of the flood, when the streets were empty and surveillance was scattered, to take Galina Ivanova. When a suspect was arrested and the party announced capture, he did not flee. He killed Valentina Stenikova and then traveled south on a holiday voucher. He was not a man acting on pure, uncontrolled impulse. He was managing his actions with something disturbingly close to operational awareness, which made him, in the assessment of the forensic psychiatrists who ultimately evaluated him, entirely sane. Filippenko attempted to escape the consequences of that sanity determination. Facing the inevitable, he presented himself as mentally unwell. He feigned symptoms. He constructed, or attempted to construct, a performance of psychiatric disorder sufficient to argue that he had not been legally responsible for his actions. It was his final manipulation, one last attempt to use performance as a shield the way he had used his Druzinic armband as a shield. The comprehensive forensic psychiatric examination did not agree. The panel of experts found him sane. Legally, clinically, unambiguously responsible for every choice he had made and every act he had committed. He had known what he was doing. He had planned his approaches, managed his risks, adapted his behavior to changing circumstances. He had maintained a functional professional life, participated in civic organizations, performed his duties at work without incident. He had simply, alongside all of that, been killing women. He was sane. And therefore he would face the full consequence of Soviet criminal law for 5 murders. The trial was not prolonged. The evidence was overwhelming. The confession was detailed and corroborated. The investigative experiments had produced a record that admitted no credible interpretation other than guilt. The court delivered its verdict: death. The sentence specified execution by firing squad. The Soviet state's standard method for capital punishment in this era, carried out in the interior of a prison by officers of the state, swift and irreversible. In November 1968, the sentence was carried out. Vasily Efimovich Filippenko, born 1936 in Kerch, died in Leningrad at the hands of the state he had manipulated and evaded for more than a year. He was 31 or 32 years old. The Obvodny Canal continued to run through the city, dark and indifferent, carrying its water toward the Neva. When a case like this finally closes, when the sentence is carried out and the files are stamped and the name is moved from the category of active threat to the category of historical record, there is a temptation to treat it as finished, as resolved, as something that began in darkness and ended in the appropriate application of justice, with clean lines and a determined conclusion. But the Filippenko case does not close cleanly. It does not resolve. It leaves behind a wreckage that extends far beyond the 5 graves of the women he killed, far beyond the man who died in a prison yard in November of 1968. It leaves behind questions that the Soviet system never adequately answered and that history has never fully forgiven. Let us begin with Igor Vorobiev. Igor Vorobiev was 24 years old when he was arrested. He was identified by a victim who could not see clearly without glasses she was not wearing. He was convicted despite the fact that his hair samples did not match the evidence taken from Nina Petikova's body. The same forensic discrepancy that had cleared Sergeyev was dismissed in Vorobiev's case as irrelevant. His wife's testimony placing him at home on the night of the crime was explicitly ignored by the court. He was sentenced to 6 years in a Soviet prison for a rape committed by Filippenko, who was, at the moment of Vorobiev's sentencing, walking the streets of Leningrad in a Drzinik's armband. During the months between Vorobiev's arrest and his trial, Filippenko committed 2 additional attacks. The investigation noted these attacks, noted that they bore the same signature as the previous crimes, and chose, officially, not to connect them to the case in which Vorobiev was awaiting trial. The blood-type coincidence, already established as the foundation of the case against Vorobiev, was not disturbed by the ongoing crimes. The logic required to maintain that fiction was extraordinary. Either 2 men with identical blood types were committing identical crimes in the same area at the same time, or the investigation was wrong about Vorobiev and the wrong man was in custody. The investigation chose the former interpretation, silently, by choosing not to examine the question at all. Vorobiev was released and rehabilitated after Filippenko's confession. Rehabilitated is a cold word for what it describes. It means that, officially, on the records of the Soviet legal system, his name was cleared. It means that the conviction was expunged. It does not mean that the years were given back. It does not mean that the relationships damaged by his imprisonment were restored. It does not mean that the humiliation and physical hardship of Soviet incarceration for a crime of sexual violence, a category that carried its own specific brutality in the prison environment, was compensated for or acknowledged. He was released and rehabilitated. He walked out of the system that had imprisoned him, and the system turned its attention to the next matter. Viktor Danilov's story carries a different shade of darkness. He was a man with an intellectual disability. A man who, by the established standards of cognitive assessment, had reduced capacity to understand the full implications of what was being asked of him, to resist the sustained pressure of experienced investigators who wanted his signature on a confession, to navigate the machinery of the Soviet legal process without a competent advocate. Under that pressure, he wrote a confession. He admitted to crimes that Filippenko had committed. He was presented in a police lineup and identified by a victim whose testimony had already been manipulated twice before and whose eyesight made reliable identification physically impossible. When Filippenko's confession made Danilov's innocence undeniable, the case was discontinued and Danilov was released. The investigators who had coerced his confession were among the 6 employees dismissed from the prosecutor's office. Dismissed. This was the sum of institutional accountability for what was done to Viktor Danilov, a man with an intellectual disability who had been pressured into confessing to 5 murders he had not committed, while the actual killer continued to operate and kill. And Valentina Stanikova. Her case stands as perhaps the most disturbing single act of institutional corruption in the entire Filippenko story. Not because her death was more brutal than the others, though it was horrific, but because of what the system did after she died. She was the 6th victim, not officially confirmed in Filippenko's charged murders because her case was never properly processed, but killed by him, thrown by him into the Obvodny Canal, and recovered with forensic evidence pointing unmistakably to the same perpetrator as the previous murders. The forensic results came back. Rape, strangulation, the same man. At a moment when the party had already announced the capture of the maniac, when Viktor Danilov's arrest had been presented as the resolution of the crisis, those forensic results were a catastrophe, because they proved the announcement was wrong. They proved that either Danilov was innocent or a second identical killer was operating simultaneously. Either conclusion destroyed the party's position. And so the results were changed. Someone, a specific human being with a specific role in the Soviet bureaucratic and law enforcement system, took the forensic report and altered it. The reference to rape was removed. The cause of death was reclassified. The official position became that Valentina Stenikova had been drunk and had fallen into the canal and drowned. Suicide. Accidental death. Case closed. No criminal investigation warranted. Her parents went to the prosecutor's office. They went to the Communist Party's city committee. They stood in offices and demanded that someone tell them the truth about how their daughter had died, why the evidence of violence had been erased, why the case had been closed without any investigation. They were turned away at every door. The Soviet system had made its decision. Valentina Stenikova's murder would remain, officially, an intoxicated drowning. This is what political pressure does to a criminal investigation. This is what happens when the primary goal of law enforcement shifts from finding the truth to protecting the reputation of the institutions responsible for finding the truth. Filippenko's crimes were horrific. The violence he delivered to 5 women with his bare hands represents a depth of brutality that is difficult to fully absorb. But the institutional crimes that surrounded his case, the false convictions, the falsified forensics, the dismissed testimony, the political announcements made before the evidence supported them, these are a different category of horror. Not the horror of a man who broke and became something monstrous, but the horror of systems designed to protect people choosing, deliberately, to protect themselves instead. The city of Leningrad had spent much of 1967 knowing something was wrong without being permitted to know the full extent of it. The party had authorized limited newspaper and radio notices, careful, minimizing language about the criminal situation in the Obvodny Canal area. Language designed to convey enough to provoke some level of public caution without conveying enough to generate panic or political embarrassment. Women in the canal area developed their fears and their habits accordingly, hurrying home, avoiding the embankment at night, going out in pairs when possible. The collective unease that autumn had a specific character, the knowledge that something predatory was operating in the city, combined with the Soviet citizens' well-trained instinct not to press too hard for specifics. After Filippenko's execution, the case became a piece of Soviet internal history, documented in closed files, discussed in law enforcement training contexts, eventually referenced in legal and criminological texts. The Soviet Union did not, in 1968, have the equivalent of a Western true crime tradition. There were no newspapers running detailed retrospectives. There were no documentaries being commissioned. The state controlled the narrative, and the narrative it preferred was one in which Soviet society did not produce serial killers, in which socialist conditions eliminated the root causes of deviant violence, in which order was maintained and cases were resolved. The Filippenko case was, from the party's perspective, a case that had been resolved, whatever the details of that resolution. The case eventually entered the post-Soviet public record through documentary productions in Russia that examined the era's criminal cases. 2 documentaries specifically addressed Filippenko's case. One titled Absolute Evil, part of a series called The Investigation Led, and another called Steel Fingers, from the documentary series Legends of Soviet Investigation. These productions drew on the case files and interviews with investigators from the era to reconstruct the events of 1967 and 1968. They gave the case and its victims a public identity that the Soviet period had denied them. They also gave wider circulation to the detail that is, perhaps, the most psychologically unsettling of all. That Filippenko had been part of the Druzhina patrol searching for himself. That he had received briefings. That he had walked with officers discussing the case. That he had, in the vocabulary of the investigative documents produced later, been searching for himself. The documentary titles reflect the 2 aspects of his identity that investigators found most defining: absolute evil, for what he was; steel fingers, for the specific physical, industrial quality of the violence he delivered; hands that had operated cranes; hands that had become the primary instrument of 5 murders. His victims deserve to be named and held in full, not reduced to evidence points or narrative transitions. Nina Pedakova, 19 years old, a factory worker who went out one May evening and did not return home. Tatiana Kuznetsova, 25 years old, a nurse who was killed while caring for others at the Bakin hospital. The unnamed woman who survived the July attack, who identified her attacker, and whose testimony was manipulated so many times by investigators with agendas that the truth of what she saw was almost entirely obscured. Galina Ivanova, who walked through a flooded city night and encountered the worst it contained. Fina Anchak, a student at the Leningrad Technological Institute, whose hyoid bone fractured under hands she could not remove and whose voice was taken from her before her breath. Valentina Stenikova, a fish shop saleswoman, whose murder was officially reclassified as suicide, whose parents were turned away by every office they approached, and whose truth was recovered only because a man confessed in a cell in Simferopol 2,000 kilometers to the south. These are the women. These are the names. The files exist. The case records exist. The investigative documents and the forensic reports and the transcripts of Filippenko's confession exist in the archives of the Russian legal system. The full truth of what happened in Leningrad in 1967 and 1968 is on record. What is also on record is everything that went wrong around it. The investigation that wrongly imprisoned 2 innocent men and falsified a forensic report and dismissed a mother's testimony and ignored physical evidence that didn't align with political necessity. The system that announced victory before it had achieved it, and then buried the proof of its own failure in reclassified paperwork. The 6 employees who were dismissed, no names, no criminal charges, no public accountability, while the families of Valentina Stenikova and the other victims received nothing that resembled justice beyond the abstract satisfaction of knowing the real killer had been identified and executed. There is a final detail worth sitting with. Filippenko worked as a družinik, a volunteer engaged in public order. The Voluntary People's Druzina was specifically created as an instrument of Soviet civil participation, a way of extending the reach of law enforcement through engaged citizens. The system depended on trust, on the idea that the people wearing the armband had been selected and were being supervised and were acting in the interest of the community they patrolled. Filippenko violated that trust in the most extreme way possible. He used it as a mechanism of concealment and access. Every hour he spent on patrol was an hour of cover for what he did after dark. Every conversation he had with officers about the canal murders was a private act of extraordinary contempt for the people investigating him. He was executed in November 1968. The canal went on. Leningrad went on. The files were closed and placed in archives, and the case passed from the category of active horror into the category of historical record. But the Obvodny Canal is still there, long and dark, running through what is now St. Petersburg, renamed after the Soviet Union's end. The water is the same water. The embankments are the same stone. Women still walk along them at night, as they should, as people should be able to, in a city that belongs to them. And somewhere in the city's buried institutional memory, in the archive that holds the records of those 12 months of violence and wrongful imprisonment and falsified forensics, is the full account of what a single man with broken hands and a broken interior did to a city that didn't know his name. Vasily Efimovich Filippenko, the Leningrad Strangler, Steel Fingers, the ghost of the Obvodny Canal, absolute evil, gone, but not forgotten, because the women he took from this world were real, and they deserved better, better than the nights that ended them, better than the investigation that failed them, better than the system that buried their truth. And the very least that history can do is say their names and say what happened and not look away. Thank you for being here and joining us through these dark and captivating stories. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and share with anyone who loves a good mystery. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. I always love hearing where our true crime family is watching from around the world. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and never stop searching for the truth.